Thank you very much. I normally have different fonts and different animations, but okay, this is not my computer, so I apologize in advance. I'm talking about self-transformation through game design in this presentation, and my name is Stefano. I normally work for the University of Malta, and you see it's all scrambled, doesn't matter. During summer, I work for a college in California as a visiting professor. Now, I'm talking about self-transformation through game design, and there's a little warning for you because I'm going to talk about an experiment, actually like a pilot study that involves some empirical research. So brace yourselves. All right, so I conducted a research, or rather this experiment, with the BSI, which is the Behavioral Science Institute in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. And some of the scholars there are busy with implicit attitudes. So what are implicit attitudes? There are automatic judgments through which a subject evaluates an object or a situation. Normally they can be positive or negative. And in particular, the BSI is working with food-related implicit attitudes. So implicit attitude towards especially fatty and sugary foods. So a positive association with unhealthy food can have a number of causes, right? For example, the family you were raised into, the culture you're from, the culture you're in, the kind of representation in media and advertisement of food of that kind. For example, take Coca-Cola's advertisement. I think it's quite obvious how this sugary drink full of chemicals is portrayed in a sort of happy, joyous fashion. So the hypothesis of the key study that they're running at BSI with the people that I talked to, at least, is that generally teenagers, due to media exposure or culture, have a high, positively high attitude towards fatty and sugary foods. And they believe that these positive attitudes, so even pre-conscious predisposition, is key for understanding teenage obesity in the Western world. Right? Obviously, what they're trying to do is, well, if we establish the connection and find ways to lessen this implicit attitude, we might fight off some of these ideas. So how to prove their hypothesis? Well, what they're trying to do is they take a group of obese Dutch teenagers, and they measure their implicit attitudes with a simple tool, which is called an implicit attitude test, which is a computer-based test that you can run. It's quite accurate. And then they decided to take some parts, a portion of this general population, and to use psychological methods, which are generally conditioning methods, to lessen these sort of implicit attitudes. I don't know what this computer is doing. Okay, should I ignore it? Yes. Okay, good. So you imagine if we take a portion of these teenagers, we lessen their implicit attitudes, and then we follow how their dietary habits and their weight changes, right? So in that way, by performing such an experiment, they can sort of establish whether there's a direct connection between the two. So the twist here is that they asked the University of Malta to help out in that direction by sort of not using traditional psychological methods, but to embed these psychological methods and change them and adapt them to the digital medium. They said, since we're working with teenagers, perhaps it's going to be more original, more interesting, and more efficient to sort of transform and change these methods into game dynamic, game mechanics, game aesthetics, and so on. So essentially, we talk about transformative game, or would we be talking about transformative games if the formatting were correct, but it's not. So what did I decided to do? I used to be a game designer for the games industry, then I turned into an academic of sorts. Sometimes I do neither of these things, but in general, as a teacher, I have a cohort of game designers, and I decided that it would be a nice challenge for them to sort of try to accomplish this task, because it's not simply a design task when you're given sort of a client brief and so on, but they needed to sort of liaise with an academic field, that of behavioral psychology and cognitive psychology, to be able to translate some of their methods into game design. So there was also like an academic dimension to their effort, not simply like a gameful one. Which methods do they normally use? Yes, there are three methods. You're going to see one for the obvious reasons. Again, we use evaluative conditioning, a go-no-go paradigm, and an attentional bias paradigm. Given the fact that I have 20 minutes here and I've been hijacked by technology, I'm not going to go into the fine details of all these psychological methods, but if you decide to read my paper and you're so kind, you can find a detailed description of what they consist of exactly. Okay, so at the end, we ended up with a 5 usable game for research after a cycle of roughly 5 months that, in a way, translate these methods into game mechanic, game dynamics, or game aesthetics. So the goal here was to create games capable of lowering the IAT, the implicit attitude test scores for those children, rather teenagers. And you might ask, so you're talking about this during a philosophy conference, so what's the philosophical relevance here? And Paolo already pointed out in his presentation that, well, this is nothing new or nothing particularly shocking. It's nothing perhaps even particularly philosophical. I mean, some games can indeed be understood as sort of psychological machine or conditioning machines for a number of reasons, especially in the way we traditionally understand game mechanics. So where does the philosophy part come into this talk? You might wonder. The philosophy part actually connects to a paper that I've given to the previous iteration of this conference in Istanbul that was called Freer Than We Think, and it would focus on game design as a self-fashioning practice. I repeat it, as a self-transformative or self-fashioning practice. Feng, after me, will talk about self-fashioning in a very Foucauldian term. My paper was based on Foucault as well, so we have a definite connection, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say after me. So, what do I mean when I say video games as self-transformative activities or practices? In general, we talk about transformative practices as activities that are designed and engage with in order to obtain certain particular changes. This is sort of like a very general definition. For example, if we decide to engage in a particular form of meditation, we willingly do it, we expect certain kind of results that are embedded in a way in the way that the meditative practice was designed or thought of. When, or at least we used to travel in romantic times and at the beginning of the century, like that was sometimes, quite often, at least in literature, enterprise with a sense of sort of changing one's own perspective, enlarging one's own horizons, and so on and so forth. Other typical, like sort of transformative activities are going to psychotherapy, like you decide to go, or you are forced to go for a specific reason, you go and you try to transform or get transformed through talking and other methods, I mean, in a way which is deliberate and designed for that scope. In the same way, we use games constantly, like normally, to transform ourselves in many ways. If you think about the field of, say, serious games, like we designed and developed games specifically to change our behaviors to become more efficient as, for example, physicians or pilots. But behaviors are not the only things we can change via video games. If you take Paolo's games, for example, he created games that help us sort of rethink our position and our convictional attitudes, for example. Even Paper Please can be seen as sort of a way to change ourselves in relation to, say, power and bureaucracy, right? So not all serious games tend to focus on one particular cognitive aspect. And once again, you might be asking, okay, but once again, we're talking about things that are sort of have been established in culture for like 10 years at least. I'm thinking of the myth of foundation of bogus, as Sebastian would say. So this is the interesting part. In my paper, I'm not addressing the transformational power of video games, as in how we design and develop games for our players to change, but rather how they change the designers that designed them. In that sense, I call them self-transformative games. Can we self-transform ourselves through the practice of designing? So what happens to the designers when they're engaged in the process of designing a game that is supposed to be transformative for their audience? The conceptual base for my paper says that, in general, every kind of design that we do externalizes our knowledge and sensitivity. So it asks us, inherently, to integrate our knowledge or to complete our knowledge, to redigest our knowledge so that somebody else can benefit from it or can absorb it. And you can think about, I don't know, writing a recipe book, preparing a conference presentation, designing a video game, they all ask you to sort of, first and foremost, become aware of your own position, restructure it, integrate it, be able to explain it to somebody else. They're all strikingly similar to, say, teaching, in a sense, right? So structuring an educational experience or structuring communication for somebody else to get something requires us to change and integrate and grow before we're able to fully break down and explain a phenomenon of any kind. As a matter of fact, Seneca the Young, the famous Roman, say, thinker, one of his most famous quotes says something along the lines of, when we teach, we are the first who learn ourselves, right? So the process of teaching is inherently transformative for the person who teaches. Most of you here are teachers. I suppose you probably went through the process of having to teach and desperately trying to crawl through material. And the more you do it, the more you sort of try, the better informed you get about your own topic, the clearer your exposition gets, the more engaging your way of communicating to the students. And we also use these methods as to evaluate our students. Like, essentially what we ask them to do is teach us back things, right, via papers or defenses or presentations. So these methods are quite evident and quite already used in culture, but we never kind of turned our attention to game design or design in general as one of those we learn from it by doing kind of experiences. So I call them self-transformative game design. I would have if, okay, yeah. So the idea here is that through the process of designing a video game with transformational intentions, the designers themselves change through the process. And you go like, yeah, this is good and proper. In the previous presentation, you told me, yes, that's an interesting point of view, but so what? And how do you prove it? So I try to prove it. This is not new by any means of the imagination, because if you're a game designer or a teacher, you experience these things firsthand. Paolo already mentioned this. Diedra Kai also said something quite similar already. But this particular point, that game design might be an educational practice itself, was never brought to the academic fore, to my knowledge at least. So I tried to do it. Paolo, you look beautiful in this one. All right. So how to prove this idea? Do you remember when I told you about these games here, right? So I had my students design games supposed to change implicit attitude towards fatty and sugary foods. So what I did secretly, without my students knowing, and there are two in the audience, yes, over there, I tracked their implicit attitude towards the same kind of food. So do you understand? Like, I tricked them into taking tests and so on. And what you see here is a graph mapping these results. So on this scale, it's the positive implicit attitude towards food. So the higher it is, the more likely it is that these people will prejudge healthy food positively. The blue bar is the first measurement that I did at the beginning of the design process. The red bar is the second measurement that I did at the end of the design process, right? And you can tell it's a very small sample. I had a class of 9 people. So this is probably not acceptable under many scientific standards, but the idea here is like trying to prove a point that might motivate further research. So that's why I call it a pilot study. One thing that we can tell from this scheme to begin with is that everybody in the generation that I was teaching, so they're roughly in their 20s, is already positively biased towards healthy food. You don't see anybody in a negative. So for whatever reason, maybe I was very lucky with my students, they were all positive to begin with. 2 students decided not to undertake this particular design task. They decided to design their own game because they had other plans, they wanted to participate to another conference, and, well, they had their motives. I call them control, even if that's sort of a bit nobilitating to people. Okay. So what do we see here? In general, I think you can tell by the bars that from the beginning of the experiment to the end of the experiment, many of the people who actually did engage in the process raised the positive attitude towards healthy food. So you see, like, for example, that subject 4 is the one that improved the most, and he was one of the ones that actually did design a changing game. Whereas subject 6, who didn't design it, was the one who experienced the most decrease of positivity. For whatever reason. I have no idea why. So if we take it as an average, we see that the group that designed food-related games had a positive in total growth of this implicit attitude, meaning that they became more positive towards healthy food. And the two ones that didn't do that actually either decreased, no, both decreased slightly. Do you see that? Subject 6 and subject 9. So it would appear that my hypothesis is sort of confirmed. So did the students' attitude change while designing? And it turns out that, well, almost all of them actually got better or got a more positive attitude towards healthy food. So it's a tentative answer. With 9 people, you cannot really come up with like science-worthy results. But I think these results encourage for further research in this field. Question 2 would be like just interesting to look at. Did they also decrease in weight while that happened? So is there a correlation? Do you remember the correlation that the BSI were trying to figure out at the beginning of the talk? Did they actually lose weight? I have a graph for that as well. Okay. This is the recording of the weight of the 9 participants. Yellow is at the beginning of the process and blue is at the end of the process. Now, a little caveat here. The process went for 5 months, so it spanned from winter till summer. That means that this sort of weight calculation is not really reliable, meaning that there are seasonal changes that affect weight, there is stress that affect weight, and I measured the final weight when they were about to deliver the finals. So I'm not quite sure whether this is reliable. And I also have a lot of protection against that in my paper because I don't know if I can trust it. However, these are the 2 people who decided not to take it, and you see that in both cases, they grew their weight, right? They both gained weight. The biggest loser was this guy with 6 kilograms lost, and the biggest gainer was again subject 6, who probably had a hard time during that year with me, and he gained 4 kilograms. So in general, we can tell that the first group, the ones who designed video game, lost as a mass of a class 7 kilograms altogether, whereas the second group gained 6 kilograms. Now, I told you I'm not really fond of this weight thing. I think it's very sketchy and not reliable. However, like, it seems that there's some correlation. However, we couldn't find any correlation between how much one gained positive attitude towards food and how much he lost weight. So there's no statistical connection, apparently. So in conclusion, this is my last slide. Albeit not conclusively, our hypothesis seems to be sort of corrected or in a way supported by the experiments. However, the weight one remains a question. Like, it seems like they lost weight, but there's no real connection with implicit attitude. Maybe the hypothesis of our partners is wrong. So maybe there's no real connection between this cognitive idea and losing weight. I'm planning future research in which I will try to figure out if this same process is also valid for things that do not have to do with attitudes. As a matter of fact, we can test with behaviors, cognition, or even convictions, for example, political ideas. For example, did Paolo change his political views by designing some of his games? Probably if we could find a way to track it, we would see that or not. So the idea here is that I will continue this and try to get larger samples and try to still figure out whether design is a inherently educational practice. It looks like it might be. There are good chances. Another thing that I might be looking into is whether knowing that you're engaging a transformative design practice might be fostering or stopping you from actually developing that transformation. Well, that's it. Sorry for the bad slides. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, questions?
I have a question. Thanks for the very interesting talk. Would you think that it is also transformative if you would ask your subjects to write a book about this topic in your seminar?
Sebastian, this is such a great question because in the paper I made this point, but I couldn't fit it into the time that I had. My point here is not that design is exceptional as a design practice. So all form of structured communication or structured experience for somebody else might have the same impact. Actually, it was already studied in several of these fields. I'm just pointing the light on game design saying, hey, we have a new tool and new sort of affordable ways of producing content that might be useful for education, and yet we haven't started to think about it. So by no means an exceptionality case here, but I'm just saying we are neglecting the fact that by doing game design and by teaching game design, we might also engage in education in a new way. Right? And so this is the key point that I'm trying to bring home. Not that game design is particularly great. If I could ask for a question, I would like my students to sort of like, well, actually I would like to ask you a question like, what was it like to go through it, and did you perceive a change, Jonathan? Sorry for reverting the idea, but I mean, it's kind of interesting, yes.
Thanks for the warning, first of all. As I was doing the experiment, to be honest, I didn't notice much, mostly because you try to keep it as secret as possible, and that one thing I noticed is, first of all, I'd even put less weight, excuse the pun, on the weight graph for one simple reason, that we didn't measure ourselves before, because we didn't know what it was
self-reported,
for.
right?
It was self-reported, and quite frankly, I was estimating for both of them. So I might have gained weight, I might have lost weight, I'm not sure. But even, I still feel the same. But even for the experiment itself, while it could be the game design, and I'm not saying that's probably not, I think during the game design I did become more conscious of healthy food. You must also realize that at the same time I was reading a lot about healthy food. I was reading a lot about no-go conditioning papers and behavioral psychology. So it might not have been game design, it might have been...
My point here is exactly that the practice of design involves liaising with the client, researching your topics, integrating your knowledge, and so on. So it's not just the pure act of writing code. It's the whole process. So by engaging in this process, you necessarily revise your own beliefs, integrate your own beliefs, and are asked to, in a way, sometimes imagine that this was an interesting point that somebody made, like, what if I didn't originally believe that salad is healthy for you? Well, we figured out that some of these cases are resolved through cognitive dissonance. Have you heard about that? So in some cases, like these convictional methods pass through asking you to go against your belief long enough and thoroughly enough that you ultimately lessen the strength of that belief or change that belief entirely. When I told you that part of the methods that I'm using are close to conditioning, this is what I'm talking about. Yes. Thank you, Jonathan. Sorry for calling you out like this.
I'm a little curious as to which subjects I'm sitting next to here. I really like this. I really like the graphical display of data and what it allows you to do, I think. Of course, I'm a little hesitant about sort of a sample size of 7 subjects, and I think if you run a t-test on this, not that I'm a particular fan of those, but I think if you scroll up to, no, just keep that one there. If you look at the subjects 2 and 4, they have similar sort of responses here, and subject 4 is having a massive response in terms of this. Now, if you go to that weight chart, though, look at subject 2 and 4's weights, though, right? So they have exactly opposite measures here, even though they're the ones that react very sort of strongly to the IIT. And I just think that's a kind of thing that you can use for sort of thinking about things, right? One person obviously, I don't know, learned something from the IIT, but also put on weight. So it seems to me that the score to weight thing is very sort of improvisational here.
I agree with you completely. Not only the weight was self-reported, it spanned over 5 months, it might be subject to other things, and it was not even part of my hypothesis.
No. So the interesting thing is just that they have a reverse effect between those two subjects.
So we could look into what happened. Yes, I think that, but I agree with you. With 7 people and the first experiment ever run on these kind of ideas, I can't say much, and I don't even trust this graph.
No.
But at least this one tells us something that is a little more reliable. It looks like there's a sort of consistency. And from here, we can maybe start to do better research. That is sort of...
Right. But we still need some p-values.
If you want to join, we can do it together.
Hi, I'm sorry I have to say this, but as a psychologist and a game designer, I have some really serious critique points. First, at your study, you said it's a private study, and so maybe I stop there, but I think one of the biggest problems is that you use people who chose on purpose to do another game as a control group. I think this is the biggest problem in your data there. Not only that it's a very low number, but also as a game designer, I'm a bit sad that I think you somehow flatten what games are capable of. Not only making like people understand facts better, but also have a kind of insight in systems or structures. And for me, this would be something where I would think, okay, this is what I, as a game designer, learn every time more and more. And everything else is more like not connected to game design itself. And it doesn't have to be games.
Thank you for your comment, and I'll see whether research proves you right or wrong. Thank you.
Just have a very short technical question. Is there a correlation necessarily between healthy food and weight gain or weight loss? Because you can eat a lot of healthy food and still gain weight. So this kind of connection between healthy food and weight was problematic for me. I'm not an expert, but that was a little red lamp in my head. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't, because this is not my hypothesis. It was that of my partners that we also checked.
Because it's the amount you take in. I mean, you can take in a huge amount of healthy food. I mean, you can eat salad, so tons of salads, and still gain weight, you know. Yeah, no, but I mean, so yeah, sorry, I just had a little problem with that. I mean, you didn't explain exactly how you consider these factors.
If I could briefly answer to that, like I told you that this is not necessarily my idea, this was the idea of my partners. So we use the same data to try to validate their idea as well, to see whether in this initial group here we could see a correlation, or at the beginning of a correlation between being positive towards healthy food and losing weight. It appears from the data that might be something there, but it's not conclusive. But I don't think they even went into quantities or anything. So I have no idea. I have no idea where they came up with this hypothesis or whether quantity is involved.
Last short question.
You mentioned like some of the psychological methods that you're using, and of course, if you're setting out a topic that someone tries to research that topic and prove that topic, that they might change their opinion about it. But I think if you go on doing the research, it would be especially interesting to compare game design to other ways of doing that, like reading or writing a book or whatever, to see if there's a stronger or lesser effect. I think that would be very interesting to see.
Absolutely agree. Take it as it is. It's like a small test that I could run in secret. So, yeah.
I think I have one last short comment from the psychologist.
No, I have something to add. This is maybe a bit more constructive. Sorry for being maybe a bit
I think you might be
too
completely
hard
right
now.
You might be completely right, but until we have data, I mean, we're just arguing about the possibilities. Right? So.
But just a research idea that I just had. The next time you could do exactly the same, but pay the students for designing. Because then you know if they really do this choice because they invest.
I think it's a great idea. I co-wrote a grant to continue this thing, so if we have money for this research, maybe this could be like a very good way to sort of level out the field. As you said, it is possible that this is completely biased because the ones who didn't want to participate in research are already not interested in perhaps that topic. So I'm with you completely. Thank you for this constructive advice. Yes.